Thank you very much, Jewel, and thank you everyone for coming. Oh, I see Neil there. You want to stand up? Neil Symes, candidate for Mansfield. One Nation candidate for Mansfield. I also want to say that I start every speech in the Senate with the words, as a servant to the people of Queensland and Australia, because that's exactly what I am. And I also want to make the comment that I am fiercely pro-human. And I think everyone in this room is also pro-human. And I mention that as a start because that's the real issue. It's not climate or the corruption of climate data. It's about whether or not we're pro-human and believe in humans and humanity. So let's go straight into climate. To justify the cutting of human production of carbon dioxide, we need to do four things. We need to first of all prove that the temperature is warming unusually or at an unusually, increasing at an unusual rate, and we need to show that it's continuing to warm. So let's just have a look at the temperature records. As Patrick Moore said, the temperature for the last 22 years has been flat. And that is, by the way, despite record quantities of carbon dioxide produced by humans. So clearly the temperature is flat and it's not being increased by carbon dioxide. The second fact on temperature is the longest temperature trend in the last 120, maybe even 160 years, was 40 years between 1930s and 1976, during the Second World War and the post-war economic boom, when the production of carbon dioxide by we humans increased dramatically. And that temperature trend was 40 years of cooling. The third fact is that in the 1930s in America, the temperatures were warmer than today. And the United States has the world's best climate network, or best climate measuring network. And the fourth fact is that the temperatures in Australia in the 1890s and 1880s were warmer than today. Now, coming back to the Bureau of Meteorology, the temperatures for many towns around, especially the southeast of Australia, have shown a trend over 100 years of decreasing. And with gradual modulation, they've been increased. And there's no reason for that. They've been consistently fiddled upwards. So coming back to the temperatures, there is no temperature, there's no increase that's unusual. If you look back over the last 359 years, the Central England temperature record, it just goes up and down, warming, cooling, and we're now flat, heading for another cooling most likely. Every 30 or 40 years in Brisbane, we get a flood. The floods in the 1890s, there were 3 in 1 year, I think, and all worse than the latest flood we had here, in even worse than 74. Our biggest flood was around 1841, I think. So there's nothing unusual happening in climate, not in temperatures, not in rainfall, snowfall, ocean alkalinity, pH, acidity. They call it acidity. They're calling it ocean acidification. The ocean is actually alkali, it's not acid. And it's been flat, just around 8.4 on a pH scale. No trend occurring. So the next thing, so there's no temperature increase. Well, we can all pack up and go home. But let's look at the other claims. The other claims are that the temperature is rising because the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is rising. So let's have a look at that. If you look closely at the actual atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, it does this on a seasonal basis. And that, to understand why, we have to understand the fact that the oceans contain around 50 to 70 times more carbon dioxide in dissolved form than in the entire atmosphere. Then we also have to understand Henry's law, which goes back to 1803, well accepted in science, and that is that the net result of Henry's law is that the solubility of carbon dioxide going into the oceans increases as the temperature of the oceans decreases. So every winter, and the next fact you need to understand is that in the southern hemisphere, the area of oceans is about 50% more than in the northern hemisphere. So when our southern hemisphere oceans cool, because it's a massive area covered by the ocean in the southern hemisphere, they cool, they absorb huge quantities of carbon dioxide, and the level in the atmosphere goes down, despite us producing roughly the same all year. So if nature drives down the level of carbon dioxide, who's controlling the level? Nature. We are not having any impact. Then when we go into our summer, the temperatures at the surface of the ocean increase and they release enormous quantities of carbon dioxide. So what you'll find then is cooling, warming every year. The carbon dioxide levels follow the temperature, follow the temperature changes. And Patrick Moore is correct. There are many periods where there's no correlation, where the carbon dioxide level goes down and the temperature goes up. There are periods where the carbon dioxide goes up and the temperature goes up. But overall, all we can see is that on a seasonal basis, it goes up and down following the temperature change. And many other factors combine to show that human production of carbon dioxide can have no effect and is not having an effect on the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The third factor is that the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere doesn't drive temperature. Temperature on a seasonal basis drives the carbon dioxide level. We're told it's warming, it's not. We're told that carbon dioxide determines the temperature, it's the reverse. We're told that we determine the level in the atmosphere, it's the reverse. We do not. On all three counts. So then let's assume then it was warming and it was caused by carbon dioxide and we affect the carbon dioxide levels. The fourth question is, and all of those are wrong, but the fourth question then is warming detrimental? Do we have to shut down our production of carbon dioxide? And the answer is no. Warming is highly beneficial to the planet, to humans, to civilization, to animals and to plants. So even if we were warming the planet, we wouldn't stop because it's beneficial. Crop yields increase, plants and animals survive. When do human deaths increase? Cold or warm? Cold. Disease is rampant. It's just plain miserable. And that leads into another topic, which is energy prices. Based upon the nonsense we've been told in climate, we're now having people facing the choice of do I eat or do I heat? That's happening in Europe, happening in Britain, happening in Australia. The consequences aren't as severe, but still people in their later years die because of the cold. So this climate nonsense is driving perverse policy. So there's nothing happening in climate whatsoever. It's just natural cycles. And we can see that. So if you then think about a few more things that have been happening, we see John Howard, for example, in 2007, Kevin Rudd got a big increase in the polls. Remember, based on the global warming scam? And saying it's the greatest moral challenge of our time. The greatest moral challenge of our time is the corruption of science causing this claim about our carbon dioxide. That's the greatest moral challenge of our time. So anyway, Kevin Rudd took a burst in the polls. So rather than expose him for his lies and nonsense, and Penny Wong and Greg Combet and Peter Garrett and Julia Gillard, instead of exposing them and Christine Milne and Bob Brown, instead of exposing them for misrepresenting climate, John Howard said, well, we'll do something about it down the road. Now, by doing that, what did he do? He sanctioned it. He endorsed it. And then think of what else he did as a result of that. He promised to put in place Australia's first emissions trading scheme in 2012. Emissions trading scheme, as Tony Abbott said, and other Liberals have said, is another carbon tax. So John Howard is the first leader of a major political party to put in place a carbon tax as part of his party's policy. It wasn't Kevin Rudd. It was John Howard. The second thing that John Howard did was he brought and put in place the renewable energy target. Now, I don't call them renewables, I call them intermittents, because that's what they are. But he brought in the renewable energy target. And just a couple of months ago, there was John Howard saying that this renewable energy target had gone crazy. It was 2% when he left office. It's now, 13% and heading for 23%. Hello, we're following his scheme that Tony Abbott increased and continued. He increased the target. But John Howard's scheme is the one that we're now living under, with energy prices rising dramatically. Thanks to John Howard. Yet the man has the temerity to come out and complain about it. Third thing, how many people here used to vote Liberal? Yeah, I guessed it would be most of us. All right, I stopped about 3 elections ago. I started to wake up. There is nothing more sacrosanct to a true Liberal, to a true Conservative, than private property rights. Am I correct? Yes. That is fundamental. So remember John Howard said he wouldn't sign the Kyoto Protocol, and we went, good on you, John. But he said, we will comply with it. Remember that? He said that. Now, he had 2 choices. We either shut down industry to reduce the production of carbon dioxide, or we stop the clearing of land so that more carbon dioxide can be absorbed. So John Howard knew he'd get into strife publicly if he shut down industry, so he chose to steal farmers' property rights and stop them clearing land. It's in writing from Peter Beattie. John Howard and Peter Beattie colluded to get the native vegetation protection legislation in this state to steal farmers' property rights. Bob Carr is on YouTube videos gloating, laughing, as he said that Johnny Howard came to him and said, let's take the farmers' property rights. And Bob Carr laughed. He laughed for one reason. If the Commonwealth government takes a farmer's property rights, the Commonwealth has to pay compensation. If the state does it, no compensation. He stole farmers' property rights and deliberately avoided compensation. And I've been chairing the Senate Select Committee inquiring into lending to primary production customers, and the number of farmers that have suicided over what the banks have done, the number of farmers who are in trouble because they can't access their land in a drought. They can't increase, they paid for a certain value of land, they can't use it now, they can't convert it to cropland. It's just disgraceful. And then what do the Greens do? This is the state of our country, but remember, I'm very, very pro-human. What the Greens do is they tell us the barrier reef is under threat from farming. Why would a farmer put on excess fertilizer because it comes out of his hip pocket or her hip pocket? Why would a farmer put on excess pesticides because it comes out of their hip pocket? Why would a farmer farm the land in a way that causes soil to be lost? Because it affects the value of his or her land down the road when they come to retire or give it to their kids or sell it. It doesn't make sense, but that's the world we're living in, where the Greens tell us the last person who should be in charge of the land is the person who owns it. It's just insane. So we've got this climate change nonsense. Someone was talking about the barrier reef. The barrier reef, according to an article, scientific article, said that 16 times since the 1928, the barrier reef has endured, bleaching, thank you. In 2008, remember when we had the record cold temperatures in southeast Queensland and in Townsville and in Darwin? We had record cold temperatures and the reef in the southern portion of the reef, it bleached. Why did it bleach? For the same reason it bleaches when there's unusual but not abnormal high temperatures for a prolonged period. And then it recovers very quickly. And our office arranged, and Pauline joined us and the other senators. We went up to Keppel, when was that? Late last year. And we took reporters to a place on the reef near Keppel Island where it had bleached 3 or 4 years earlier. And we said, look. And then they said, yeah, but you're 1,000 kilometres away from where it's bleaching now. And we said, thank you. Because people are telling us that the whole reef is bleached. And then people say it's global warming that's causing the reef to bleach. Well, hang on. A part of the northern third is bleaching, naturally. The middle portion is not bleaching at all. The southern portion wasn't bleaching at all. So if it's global, why isn't everything being bleached? It's just insane. And there's no acidification going on. It's just natural variation in the pH levels, the ocean alkalinity. So the scares we're being told are just nonsense. But when we're told these scares, and when foreign tourists are told these scares, they don't come to the Barrier Reef. So that affects the tour operators, it affects the motel keepers, it affects the chemists, it affects the service stations, it affects the supermarkets, it affects the whole of our state. It affects our state revenue. So that's the damage it's doing. But there's even more damage going on, and that's due to the Finkel report, or rather, John Howard's renewable energy target that he brought in 2007. So what happens under that is that we subsidize people with costlier electricity production. Who pays for that? We do. The taxpayers or the electricity users? Now, electricity consumers. You can't see this. I try to avoid PowerPoint. That's because it's too unreliable. But there's a graph here. This is price up here, consumer price index. The lower graph shows that the consumer price index since 1980 has increased by about 4 times. The prices are 4 times higher. Energy prices bubbled along just on that until around 2008, 2007. Hang on. Yep. And then they shot up. And they're now 8 times what they used to be. Double the CPI electricity prices. And why? There are 3 reasons, but the biggest one is renewable energy target. So, what happens when we raise energy prices? What do we do to unemployment? We increase unemployment, yes. We decrease jobs. What else do we do? What do we do to the environment? Think about this one, because if we shut down clean energy here and we allow them in, say, less developed countries to burn coal there in smoggy old power plants, what happens to the level of sulfur dioxide? What happens to the level of nitrous oxides? What happens to the level of particulates? Increases. They're real pollutants. So we're actually harming the environment, killing our jobs, raising prices, and what else? Think about this one. The Greens, the socialists. The ALP are largely socialists. But they fight, so they say, for the poor. Who pays the most and is hurt the most by high energy prices? The poor, because electricity is not a luxury anymore. Everyone has to have it. It's a higher percentage of their income. It's a highly regressive tax on the poor, thanks to the Greens and thanks to the ALP and thanks to the LNP, because they don't have the guts to speak up. And the LNP are the ones who brought in the renewable energy target. And the LNP in this state are joined, correct me if I'm wrong, Neil, joined in voting for the Palaszczuk budget. And that included a target of what? 50%, wasn't it? And the LNP is running around in this state saying that they will bring back coal-fired power after who raised it? We did. Because there's nothing wrong with coal-fired power stations so far as the air is concerned. And then they claim that they're going to put up to a 50% renewable energy target. How can they do that? How can they say that? So then what we have is the Finkel report coming out. And the Finkel report is just like the Stern report, just like the Garneau report. It's a fabrication. They use incorrect assumptions and get whatever answer they want. Now, Alan Finkel is a doctor of science and engineering. He is the chief scientist. He was appointed, I think, by Malcolm Turnbull. And I've been on about climate change and the empirical evidence, because that's what you need to do on science. It's always decided by empirical evidence. Not by the number of people who agree with you, not by the number of reports that are produced, not by the names that are people who are advocating it, but you go by science, but by empirical evidence. You know what empirical evidence is? Hard, measured data. Physical observations. And I've just shown you the data, and it shows that we are not affecting the climate and we cannot affect the climate. Nonetheless, I've been in Parliament and I've been asking questions, and Senator Ian MacDonald from the LNP and from Townsville area, he sat down next to me in Senate estimates when I was asking Finkel questions and Sinodinos, who's the Science Minister, questions. And as I finished, he said, "Jesus, good having you in Parliament." Because this is the first time we've had a senator ask questions, and when they respond, he takes them further. Okay, but here's the key point. So Senator MacDonald then asked the really sensible questions, and we give credit where credit's due. We don't worry if someone's Liberal or in another party. He asked a really sensible question. His question of the Chief Scientist was, is it right that Australian production of carbon dioxide is about 1.3% of the total human production? And Alan Finkel said, yes, that's correct. And then Senator MacDonald said, what would happen, what effect would it have if we shut down all Australian carbon dioxide production? And the Chief Scientist waffled and waffled and waffled. And Ian just said, just answer the question. And he said 2 words and hung his head. Virtually nothing. The only thing wrong with that answer is the word virtually. Is nothing. Senator MacDonald was so taken aback by that, he started asking the next question, which was, so what would happen if we cut it by 50? And then he realized, I don't have to ask anymore. He's already told me that even if we cut it 100%, there's nothing that'll happen. So we are destroying jobs, forcing people to have a choice between heating or eating, killing industry, increasing real pollutants around the world based upon something that will have no effect. One of the first things I did after being sworn into the Senate was I went outside and wrote a letter to the CSIRO, the chief executive. And I said to him, I would like a presentation on your empirical evidence within 2 weeks. And we eventually tracked him down, and I think it was a couple of months later we got that presentation. There's no evidence showing that we are affecting the climate. None. So I wrote a report back and I said, okay, now here's my report. And then in Senate estimates, I asked the Science Minister, will I be getting a response? And I asked the CSIRO Chief Executive, and he said no. And the Science Minister, so I asked him, and he said, yes, you'll be getting a response. So we got a response when I submitted my report to a committee. And the response was kid stuff. It was 2.5 pages, not a single reference to anything scientific. It was just waffle. So we met with the chief scientist, and the chief scientist thought he could, we were hillbillies. I don't know what he thought, but he and the science minister treated us with not much respect. Then we started raising some facts. And the chief scientist said, I'm not a climate expert. I don't understand it. That office of the chief scientist has been advocating this nonsense for years. And you and I are paying for that through our taxes. And we're now paying for it through this. And our kids are paying for it by being on the dole. So then we said to the chief scientist and the science minister, we would like another meeting, and this time we want it for 4 hours, not half an hour on a sitting day. And they said, okay. And the chief scientist said to me, can I bring some scientists? I said, you can bring anyone you want. By the way, no one will debate me. If you know of anyone who takes the opposing view to me, invite them to a debate on my behalf. You have my permission. I will debate them anywhere on the empirical evidence and on the corruption of science. Anywhere. So we haven't had that second meeting with the chief scientist, and I was told just recently that our last meeting with the CSIRO was that. So we have since had another meeting with the CSIRO, and we said to them, tell us what is unprecedented in the climate record of the last 10,000 years. And then tell us, if there is anything unprecedented, the evidence that shows we're causing it and that we need to cut it. And they presented one paper, one scientific peer, well, it's being charitable calling it scientific. It's one peer-reviewed paper claiming something unprecedented. And that showed, looking at it from your perspective, a temperature rise at the end of the Ice Age and then a gradual decrease for the last 10,000 years, and then a sudden dropping off, and then a startling rise. 1 point. And the author of that original work was a PhD student. He delivered this paper when he was a PhD student, and then it wasn't as alarming. Then 2 people from the UN got involved, the UN IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, got involved, and they raised this point, 1 point. And that, after 40 years of work on climate, is what the CSIRO says is unprecedented. The author, the original PhD student, he's still one of the 4 authors. He has said publicly, you cannot rely on the 20th century temperature part of his record. So the CSIRO is going against the author himself. That's all they have. And then when it came to their proof that we're causing it, what they did was they showed us a graph showing that the level of long-wave radiation leaving the Earth's surface is decreasing, and that proves it. Oh, really? And then when you look into it, it's 2 points a few decades apart. 2 points. And then when you look further and you actually go to the satellites, it shows it's flat. So why can we pick up this basic stuff and the CSIRO can't? Who funds the CSIRO? Garth Paltridge was a senior research scientist with the CSIRO. Others in the CSIRO, or formerly in the CSIRO, have said the same thing. The CSIRO produces what it's funded to produce. So coming back to your temperature question, what's your name? Fred, your temperature question, there are 2 ways of corrupting the data, one deliberate and one inadvertent. The inadvertent corruption includes things like, well, no, that's probably deliberate. The inadvertent includes things like the United States has the best temperature records in the world, most accurate. It's got the most extensive network. It's pretty dense. And 2 scientists, Anthony Watts and I've forgotten Joe's name. He was president of the American Meteorological Society. They did a survey of all the weather stations around America, and they said that 90% of the weather stations don't meet standards for recording temperature. So there's a lot of inadvertent corruption of the data. The second one is the urban heat island effect. A lot of the weather stations had their temperature measuring device on the edge of what used to be small towns or small cities. Now the cities have grown around them. And if you look in the cities, we don't have many trees. And it becomes hotter because of the natural heat given off by a lot of our machines, air conditioning systems, etc. Some of the weather stations are now next to jet engines exhaust. I'm serious. Or they're on top of bitumen, which gets much hotter than grass. So they're all over the place. So that's the urban heat island effect. And a proper statistician in North America, Ross McKittrick, he said, he's from the University of Guelph in Canada, he showed statistically that at least half of the so-called warming is in the records is due to, since last century, is due to the urban heat island effect. If you then look at, you want to get rid of all of that, and you just look at the urban temperatures and the rural temperatures separately, in America and in Australia, the rural temperatures have decreased. The urban temperatures have increased because of the urban heat island effect, not because we're warming the planet. So that's the inadvertent corruption. Then there's the deliberate corruption, where the Bureau of Meteorology has changed cooling trends into warming trends, where NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies has eliminated the 1930s, which were warmer than today, as being warm, and decreased them. So instead of seeing this kind of thing, we see this. 1998, we had a very high temperature from the El Nino effect. We all know that. 2016, 15, similar. What they did was, remember Brian, did you see Brian Cox on Q&A last September with me?
Yes.
He held up a graph. Now think of how silly this is. He held up a graph showing the temperature doing that. And then he said, here's proof we're warming the planet. Hello, it's a graph of temperatures. Where's the proof? He's supposed to be a scientist. He's a pretty boy with pretty lips and pretty hair. He's a celebrity. He's not a scientist. You have to prove cause of the temperature. Now, the second thing is, his graph was doctored because there was no 1930s warm period. And the 1998, I pointed them both out to him. I said, where's your 1998? It's removed, because if you remove 1998, and instead of doing this to 2015-16, you just have this. And what did he do as a result? He threw the graph toward me. He spat the dummy. So what I'm getting at is there's a lot of nonsense here. Now, pretty boy, Brian Cox, I don't think he would ever have gone into it. But the ABC put him on Q&A, invited me along. Why? And who did they ask to speak first? Brian Cox, with his graph. And who was in the audience?
All lefties.
Largely lefties. So you set up the agenda and then you make it hard. But when you've got the facts, you just point out the errors. See what I'm getting at? So what happens then is we hear things like 97% of all climate scientists say that we're warming the planet catastrophically. That is also a lie. There have been three. Yeah, that's right. Science has got nothing to do with a vote. You work on the data. The data's not there. So if you don't have the data, what do? You say 97% consensus. You also say things like, well, the CSIRO says it. And you also say things like, you're just a denier. So you use a tax. And Al Gore's movie came out. It used the tax subtly. It also had an audience that always clapped and applauded whenever Al Gore said something positive about global warming. What they're doing is building the sense that everyone thinks this. And Al Gore said 97%. So one of the things about humans, one of the things we're vulnerable is that we don't like to be left out. We want to belong. We want to be accepted. Inclusion. We like to be needed. We want to be part of the herd. And so people are reluctant to speak up. Al Gore's movie did enormous damage because what it said was that if you disagree with these statements, then you're either dishonest, you're a crook, you're working for big oil, or you're using the old science. And it was already, as someone over here said, it was already going on in the universities that if you want funding, you will toe the line. And if you want funding for your study about green tree frogs, well, just explain how climate is affecting the green tree frogs and you'll get it. Even if it's not in there in the paper, you'll still get the funding. So what happens then is a lot of scientists are afraid to speak out. The ones who do are generally retired or have very secure tenure, and they get slammed. And do they get on the ABC? So you can see what's happening. So what we do is half the voices are shut down. The overwhelming majority of real climate scientists don't believe this nonsense. Most of them are not game to say it. So what we have is a massive perception that there is a consensus, a perception that there is evidence. When have you ever seen anyone on ABC, SBS, or anywhere put forward a cause and effect showing that we affect the climate? You won't, because the evidence is not there. They mock you for saying it, and what happens, though, is that we're now getting the data out there. So the CSIRO will be exposing that once we have a few more talks with them. But then we've got to get through the media. We've got to get through the political parties in the Senate. But what happens is that we know that the vast majority, and I mean vast majority, of LNP, Liberals and Nationals in Parliament in Canberra, don't believe in climate change being caused by us. Why don't they speak up?
Who's their endorsement?
Exactly. And ministers can't break cabinet solidarity. So the most vocal skeptic in Australia about 5 or 6 years ago was a man named Barnaby Joyce. How much have you heard from him on climate in the last 3 years?
But he's a Kiwi.
So that's one way of shutting it down. Cabinet ministers won't contradict their policy. Labor Party, we know that there are skeptics in the Labor Party. Kevin Rudd himself said on Q&A, there are many politicians within my own cabinet that don't agree with the carbon tax. He said that. We know that Martin Ferguson is a skeptic. I know of a couple of others that I've been told directly by people who've talked with them. We know that there are others. So why don't they speak? Because the Labor Party is worse. You're not allowed to contradict. You're just not allowed. Whereas in Pauline Hanson's party, you're encouraged to speak. So how many farmers do you think believe in this nonsense?
Nil.
How many geologists believe in this nonsense? Almost none. So the point is we've got a massive media bias and ignorance. We've got a massive political timidity. And so this goes to the heart of what Jewel was talking about, and that's the way we're governed. And that is where I want to go next just for a few minutes. Are you happy to continue?
Yes.
Okay. So we've seen the corruption of science. That's one victim. We've seen poor people. That's another victim. The people in India who can't get electricity. That's another victim. We've seen people who are losing their jobs. More victims of this scam. So one of the issues is the destruction of science and the destruction of our political process. The second issue, when I started researching this, because I was trained in carbon dioxide and I understood this couldn't be happening, so I researched it and I found out the facts I found out, and I've shared with you. When I realized the corruption, I started chasing the corruption, and that took me to the UN. That took me to the major international banks, and it took me to many of those people who are all benefiting from it. So the UN was led by a man called Maurice Strong, a Canadian. Heard of him? Who has? Very few. Okay. Maurice Strong, remember that name. He died in December of 2015, just before the Paris conference. And he is the father of this global warming claim. Maurice Strong publicly stated he had two aims in life. One was to de-industrialize Western civilization. And the second aim was to put in place an unelected global socialist governance. You don't have to be elected to govern if you can pull the right strings. So if you look at the UN, what they've got is something called Agenda 21. Who's heard of it? It's real. See that? That's not my dream. The LNP Noosa branch, the LNP Queensland state, have got a policy voted on by its members, you know the one, Neil, passed in 2013, I think, that says you will spend nothing on Agenda 21. They're spending it all the time. Because what happens is we went out to the Balonne Shire Council. We do a lot of listening. We go around the state listening when we're not in Canberra. And I asked the Balonne Shire Council, what percentage of your revenue is federally sourced every year? Oh, around about 73%. 3/4 of their revenue. Do they come with strings attached? Yes. So who's really governing the Shire Councils? Federal government. Our constitution says that we are a federation of sovereign states. Competitive federalism. Fantastic idea. The trouble is the federal government has encroached on that and now taken over power from the states in many areas. More than 50% of the expenditure of state governments is federally sourced under federal conditions, and that has been the case since about the 1980s. So who runs the states?
Federal.
Look at the Safe Schools campaigns. Where did they come from? They started in the federal. They went out, Victoria put it in place first, New South Wales, Queensland. Where did it ultimately come from?
UN.
UN. If you kill a family, where do people turn? Government. What is that? That's control. And it is socialism, you're right, but it's control. Was it elected? The UN has got many of its regulations in place at local and state level through Agenda 21, and most of the parliamentarians don't know about it. They don't know about it. The most dangerous building in this country is Federal Parliament House. There is enormous ignorance, enormous apathy. Essentially, just a handful of people in each of the tired old parties control what happens in those parties. And quite often, this Agenda 21 is dressed up as something wonderful. Sustainability, biodiversity, the tree clearing legislation, biodiversity. Sustainability looks at regulations put in place at state, local and federal level that control people's lives, transport, how they live, what they eat, energy. So if you control water, which is happening through the Murray-Darling Basin, which again is based on corrupt science, again on reversals of science. If you control energy, which is what's happening now, what more do you need to do? See that? They've got us by the balls. And that's governance, unelected governance. And it's socialist, as we just heard. So that's the second thing. We are losing our sovereignty. We are losing our ability to govern ourselves. That's fundamental. The third thing is that this is all based upon some work pushed around by the UN. It's accelerated in the 1960s by the Club of Rome, accelerated by people like Rachel Carson and Silent Spring, Al Gore, many UN bodies, and that is essentially saying two things. Humans are the scourge. Our kids, not us, we only got it later in our lives, but our kids have been raised on a diet of being told that humans are bad, evil, irresponsible, uncaring. Correct? Especially if you're white and male, yeah. Okay. But the point is that what we're now facing is sanctions against humans. And that's totalitarianism. It doesn't matter whether it's clothed in letters or with guns. It's about controlling. And so when you have peoples that are controlled, especially up here, and you have borders that are weak, and you let in other people who want to change and live by their own Sharia law, want to put females down, want to kill homosexuals, advocate violence against people who disagree with their faith, when it's not a faith, it's an ideology, comes with a complete political system. So we now have the UN. We don't know if they're competing with or assisting Islam, but they're both taking over governance of our country. So climate change sounds like just a simple little con. It's not. It's allowing global governance, permitting the destruction of our country, permitting the destruction of the borders. Because you see, what happens is that if you want to stop pollution that's being caused in Australia, real pollution, then you just have to have Australian laws. But if carbon dioxide is deemed a pollutant, it's not, by the way, but if it's deemed the problem, it's affecting the whole planet. So you need planetary laws. So then you have climate agreements like Paris. Paris Climate Agreement is not an agreement. No one's agreed to do anything. What they've agreed to do is to simply have their own little agreements for their own countries. So some countries are saying, no, we'll look at this in 30 years. Other countries are saying, we'll put on severe restrictions. Other countries are saying, we will sign up, but we're not going to do anything. And what's our dopey government doing? Implementing it. So we put out the Finkel, we paid an economist to analyse the Finkel report. The Finkel report is a complete sham. It is just a report that's been produced to give us the result that the government wants so that it can put in place a clean energy target. What's that, eh? Carbon tax. That's all it is. It's a carbon tax. The difference is that instead of the wholesaler paying the tax, the retailer does. But who ultimately pays the retailer?
Yeah.
We do. So this is very bad for increasing pollution around the rest of the world with old power stations, shutting down our production. And now it is so complex, so enmeshed with regulations and restrictions and vested interests and subsidies that even the coal-fired power stations won't get any investment because you just haven't got any certainty. How can you invest something that'll around $2 billion and it's got a life of 40 years, say? Can you justify that? So even if they wanted to, they would now have to subsidise a coal-fired power station, or at least give someone very strong surety that they would be able to continue that power station for 40 years. All because Kevin Rudd's a liar, joined by Penny Wong, Bill Shorten, Julia Gillard, Christine Milne, Bob Brown. They're the real culprits. And because John Howard and the Liberals lack the guts to go into the science. And let me finish with this before I open to questions. In 2011, 4 years after he got booted out, John Howard was invited to give the annual lecture at the Global Warming Policy Foundation in London, probably the most well-known skeptic organisation in the world, formed by Lord Lawson, Nigel Lawson, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Treasurer for Britain. And in his speech, the annual lecture for the Global Warming Policy Foundation, John Howard said, he is agnostic on climate. He hasn't made up his mind. That's what we're facing. And it's our kids that pay the price of this ignorance, stupidity, and gutlessness. It is basic human stuff. And what we need is more people to start speaking this. We need more people to join with the Conservatives and share preferences. We need more people to get out and support the little parties. Support the one that's best for you. But this country has got to be brought back. This state has to be brought back. How the hell can we have the best clean coal in the world and have among the highest energy prices in the world? Thank you. I'm happy to take questions.